What's up? Alexander here with Date Psychology. So, gonna share a paper with you today. This is basically a paper about assortative mating. There's some points I want to make in this video, but again, this is a paper about narcissism, the dark triad, assortative mating. Do women high in the dark triad pick men who are high in the dark triad? Spoiler, yes, they do, but here's the title of the paper. Women high on the dark triad traits are more attracted to narcissistic males if they're oriented to long-term mating and had fewer experiences with unfaithful men. So, some interaction effects, but we're going to look at the size of those, and we're going to look at assortative mating generally, because I think this is something maybe people underestimate. So, just an introduction, what are we looking at here? For, some of you are going to be familiar with this already. For others, it'll be completely new. So, strategic pluralism, what is this? Sexual strategies theory from Buss and Schmidt, right? Big names in evolutionary psychology. This is basically long and short-term orientations to mating, right? So what are those? Long-term mating orientations. Fewer sexual partners over the lifetime, higher emotional investment, higher commitment in relationships, longer duration, right? So the opposite of flings, hookups, casual sex. And short-term mating, what is that? Much shorter relationships, casual sex, hookups. Lower investment in romantic partners, lower emotional connection, shorter relationships. These are not things that everyone are equally predisposed to, which is really, really important. I think the way some people think of strategic pluralism is that these are two strategies that everyone has and they're just kind of equal, flat across the board. Not the case. Some people are much more oriented toward long-term mating. Some people are much more oriented toward short-term mating. That's one of the big points that I want you guys to keep in mind. Going forward, we also see sex differences in this, right? Men are much more oriented toward short-term mating than women are. So, let's go on. Personality and mating strategies, long or short-term. Who's going to be more oriented toward long-term mating or short-term mating? A lot of different personality features influence this, and one of those personality constructs that we know is related to this is the dark triad, right? A kind of constellation of personality facets that are considered antisocial behavior. So, the dark triad can explain a lot of differences in sexual strategies. Who is more long-term oriented? Who is more short-term oriented? As I mentioned in the last slide, very, very important. Not everyone is equally oriented towards short or long-term mating. So, a lot of discourse on this, is like talking about women have a short-term mating strategy and a long-term mating strategy, dual mating strategy and all of that. This is not something that's equally expressed in all women or all men. So, dark triad traits. Without going into those in a lot of detail, because I have a lot of other videos on those you might want to see, why might these be oriented toward short-term mating? So these are kind of like predator-type traits. As I mentioned, antisocial behavior. So, exploitative behavior. They can be highly agentic personality adaptations, which is something I mentioned in the last video on female narcissism and sex differences in narcissism. To some extent, these might be expressions of highly agentic behavior. So these, from the evolutionary perspective, are adaptations. They're represented in a small portion of the population, so they're an effective strategy for a small percentage of people, right? Why? Because they facilitate short-term mating. And what do we see with the dark triad and antisocial personality traits? They result in a lot of bad things for people across their lives. So that's kind of a downside to it. You engage in a lot of antisocial behavior in past environments, ancestral environments, or even the past, 2,000 years of human history, you could get executed for that. So that's something there that can cut your genetic fitness off right off the bat. But if you have a lot of short-term hookups, if you're very short-term oriented, especially before the last 100 years, before the advent of birth control and that sort of a thing, it can be associated with higher reproductive success, so more children. And that's what we see again, even today, is that individuals higher in the dark triad, they tend to have more offspring on average. So this can be kind of adaptive. So these are personality adaptations that are a niche strategy. They work for a small percentage of people. They facilitate short-term mating. So that's what we're looking at here with dark triad traits. Let's go on now to the next slide. Some examples of the dark triad and mating orientation here. What do we know from past research, basically, from the introduction of this paper? We know that individuals high in the dark triad, although they might have more reproductive success, more sexual partners over the lifetime. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're more attractive per se, nor that they're better in relationships, perhaps more importantly. We know that individuals high in the dark triad have poor long-term relationship skills. Their relationships are simply worse, even if they're able to form more of them. And probably they're able to form more of them in part, because the direction of that relationship is reversed. They're not able to keep long-term relationships together. We know that men high in the dark triad, they have lower commitment, particularly in long-term relationships. So that's another thing. If you're a man high in the dark triad, you're very short-term oriented. You're just not that interested in long-term relationships. You're not that committed to partners. You grow bored with them. You get into fights. The relationship breaks up. Whatever the case may be. We also know that the romantic partners of people that are high in the dark triad also have lower relationship satisfaction. So being in a relationship with someone who's high in the dark triad, also not good, generally. The dark triad is associated with divorce, breaking up, infidelity, all of that. So again, another explanation. Why do they have more relationships? Why do they have more partners? Because they can't keep one relationship together. And we also see that women who have more mating experience, so more promiscuous women basically, they also tend to want men who score higher in narcissism, the narcissistic facet of the dark triad. So that's another thing to consider in a lot of this discourse. Who's attracted to men high in the dark triad? Who's attracted to men high in narcissism? Often women who themselves are, which we're going to see in the main results of this paper, but also more promiscuous women, women who are themselves acting upon a short-term mating strategy are going to pick men as well who are acting upon a short-term mating strategy. So let's go on to the next slide here. Assortative mating, I've mentioned this a few times. So what is assortative mating? It's the selection for traits that are similar. So we see this across physical traits, right? We know that more attractive people pick more attractive partners. We see this for things like height. We know that taller people end up with taller partners. And we also see this, these are revealed preferences. We also see this in stated preferences. People want partners who are kind of similar to them. Assortative mating for personality is very important. In fact, it's one of the most important in mating preferences. Both, again, as a preference, stated, people like partners who are kind of similar to them, and revealed, who do people actually pick? So we talk about attractiveness, health, we talk about status, we talk about all of these mating cues very often in evolutionary psychology that are desirable. And these filter into, I think, a lot of dating discourse as well, pop psychology, that kind of a thing, just the common dating discourse. We know that there's a lot of things that make people more attractive as mates. One thing that doesn't get talked about enough is assortative mating, personality similarity. In fact, I've even heard, red pill influencers even just deny that this is even a thing, that this even exists, which is truly bizarre because this is one of the most well-replicated observations in evolutionary psychology, that we select mates assortatively, that we select people who are similar to us, both revealed and stated. So we see this for the dark triad as well. Women high in the dark triad prefer men who are high in the dark triad. And the other way around as well. Men high in the dark triad select women who are high in the dark triad. So if you think, you kind of, there's a niche of pickup artists that are kind of like, how to be a dark triad man, exercise your dark triad, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so that might work if you're able to change your personality a little bit, which, research on personality indicates it's very, very stable. You're probably not going to go from being like a really timid guy to being like high dark triad. If you were, you'd be committing crimes and things already. High dark triad is really something quite special. But let's say you were able to do that, you would be attracting a very specific kind of woman who's also high in the dark triad. So if you think you're going to be like, I'm a high dark triad man, but I want like a innocent virgin or whatever, yeah, you're exercising the wrong strategy in that case. So kind of a digression there. What else do we know? Interestingly, we have, assortative mating, which, people are happier in relationships with individuals who are more similar to them. So we see assortative mating associated with relationship satisfaction. When people are a little bit more similar, they're also happier, which also explains why did they have, a expressed or a stated preference for this and also a revealed preference, right? So you might think, well, if two people are very high in antisocial traits, that sounds really bad, right? Doesn't it? It sounds like, that's a problem waiting to happen. But some past research on the dark triad, they mention it here, and there's also some papers that they didn't mention in the introduction, but that are out there. If two individuals score higher in the dark triad, particularly in the narcissism facet, they might actually have higher relationship satisfaction than a mismatch. So a mismatch being someone who is high in narcissism and someone who is low in narcissism. And why is that? Something we know about narcissists, at least when it comes down to narcissistic personality disorder, which is a little bit different from trait narcissism, which we're talking about here in the dark triad, is, they enjoy narcissistic supply. They like validation a lot. So if you have two narcissists who are like really into each other, maybe they're just validating each other a lot and that sort of a thing. Maybe they kind of are aware of the other person's condition. They kind of pick their battles with each other. If something we know, mentioned in the previous video all about narcissism, these are people that often feel like they're being attacked unjustly by others. If they have an ally that kind of validates, their near delusions or that sort of a thing, perhaps that helps them. But if they have someone who's low in narcissism, who sees what they're doing and thinks this is really weird behavior, maybe they're not going to want to validate that sort of a thing. So anyway, assortative mating for narcissism actually might be a little bit better for narcissists, that they're picking other narcissists, at least within the context of their own relationship. For people around that couple, who knows, because it's not nice to be around a narcissist. Let's go on now to the next slide. Narcissism. It's the attractive facet of the dark triad. So, there's a lot of research on the dark triad that says women are more attracted to men high in the dark triad. The dark triad is associated with higher mating success, more sexual partners, a lot of research on this. But when you look at the individual facets of narcissism and attractiveness specifically, it tends to come down to narcissism rather than the other two traits within the dark triad, such as psychopathy or Machiavellianism. And now the dark triad has been expanded to the dark tetrad. They've included sadism. I haven't seen any research on the attractiveness of sadism, but what we know from the past research, it seems to be narcissism. So here's a passage from this. I'd like to read it to you. Among the dark triad traits, narcissism seems to be the most desirable trait in terms of mate preferences, especially in the case of women. In a scenario setting, people perceived others that were high on narcissism as desirable and attractive, detrimental to those high in psychopathy and Machiavellianism. This may be because males high on narcissism are perceived as charismatic, socially confident, entertaining, popular, and as having high social status. Males high in narcissism levels are also perceived by women as physically attractive as they pay attention to grooming. So they pay attention to their physical appearance, to presenting themselves both behaviorally and physically kind of in their best light. So that's probably why narcissism is. Now, the other traits are still associated with mating success. If you look at like number of offspring or number of sexual partners. Why? Well, think about something like Machiavellianism. Here you have a very manipulative person. Psychopathy, someone who's very bold and who doesn't fear things. So, you have someone that's just not afraid to approach people. They're afraid to be more manipulative. They're more likely to use sexual coercion. Yeah, that sort of thing is going to result in more partners, but that doesn't mean the person is more attractive. Attractiveness and desirability seems to be associated with narcissism. Someone sent me an email and asked me about this. I hope that they're seeing this video because I think this kind of explains, we see it with all of the facets, but narcissism's kind of special, standing out in the dark triad. Let's go on now to the next slide. Here are the current results from this paper. So they looked at narcissistic males, women, female scores in the dark triad, and how those predict attraction to narcissistic males, also sociosexuality and past experiences with infidelity. Sociosexuality being a measure here that they're using kind of as a proxy for long-term or short-term mating orientation. That's basically what it is. So in the regression with the dark triad traits, sociosexuality, experience with infidelity were introduced as predictors, and the model accounted for 29% of the variance of attraction to males high in narcissism. So when you introduce these, past experience with infidelity, sociosexuality, and dark triad in the women, you can explain, a pretty good chunk, right? 30% of the 29% of the variance. Pretty good. In psychology, you don't find a lot that explains a lot of the variance in something, but yeah, if you get something like that, pretty high. Not bad. Let's go on now to the next slide. Here are the attractiveness scores for women. We're looking kind of at an interaction effect. And this, I think, kind of shows you what is going on here. So the dark triad in the women, attraction to narcissists, and sociosexuality, looking at each facet. So we see a correlation here, a strong correlation, right? 0.48, by, Cohen's standards, this would be considered a medium correlation, but for psychology, a medium is about 0.3. So we're a pretty large correlation here. Women high in Machiavellianism, much more attracted to men high in narcissism. And the same for women high in narcissism and women high in psychopathy. We have an interaction effect, sociosexuality. And so what do we see here? Women high in sociosexuality, a little bit less, but you can see these lines are all pretty close to each other. So again, this is the importance of looking at effect sizes, right? If you were just to read the title, you could think like, oh, okay, this is telling a different story. You look at the effect sizes and what do you see here? A strong effect of assortative mating, a moderating effect of sociosexuality, but it's pretty small. It's pretty small. Still, it's interesting though, because women higher in sociosexuality, higher in the dark triad traits, actually a little bit less likely to be attracted to, narcissistic men, perhaps the opposite of what you would expect. Let's go on now to the next slide. So experiences with infidelity. Similar relationship here, although this was only for women high in psychopathy. Again, we see the effect of assortative mating, high psychopathy, higher attraction to male narcissists. But women that had more experience with infidelity, less. And this is a little bit larger, the moderating effect here. So yeah, I mean, maybe this is a pretty intuitive one because it's kind of like, you have a lot more experience with infidelity. You're probably going to be a little bit more cautious in your mate choices, especially since we know that, narcissistic men, much more likely to be unfaithful. So yeah, women learn. What can be said about that? I think that's a pretty intuitive result. Still, the effects are not huge, but they're a little bit bigger than the effects of sociosexuality. Let's go on now to the next slide, and I think this is the last one. So, the big take-home point here, what do we see? Assortative mating for narcissism and dark triad traits in general. We know this is a thing, and it's a pretty robust effect. Who likes narcissistic men? Narcissistic women, psychopathic women, Machiavellian women, that kind of a thing. We see it's moderated by sociosexuality, the effect was small, and moderated by past experiences with infidelity, small effect, but again, a little bit larger. What I would like you guys to remember, the take-home point from this video, I think, keep in mind that personality moderates mating strategies on an individual level, right? The field of personality in psychology is called individual differences. That's what it's called. Why? Because every individual scores differently basically in these personality traits. So, you're looking at things like personality and individual differences, actually the name of a large personality psychology journal. Personality is what determines, if someone is going to be, really oriented toward promiscuity, short-term mating or long-term mating or whatever the case may be. A lot of people, I think, make the mistake of just trying to use this as a general rule, like, oh, women have a dual mating strategy. Men also have a dual mating strategy, right? It's not just a female thing. Long-term, short-term orientations exist in men and women both. It was never just a female thing. I'm not sure, how that kind of filtered into manosphere discourse as being like a woman thing. But it was always the case in evolutionary psychology, both, and that men are much more oriented toward short-term relationships than women are. In fact, the male mating strategy is much more dualistic than the female mating strategy. I have an article on the website with a lot of research discussing that. I think it's called Intersexual Competition, Male Mating Strategies. I forget the title exactly, but whatever. Go look for it. It's up there. What else can we kind of take home from this, integrate it with other things? The bad boy discourse. Who's attracted to bad boys? I mean, we have an effect where women in general, broadly, they kind of prefer bad boys. But which women really like bad boys? Women who are themselves bad girls, basically, right? Who is really attracted to antisocial personality traits? Other people with antisocial personality traits. So, from a very practical level, if you think you're going to enhance your mating success or whatever by enhancing antisocial behavior, by trying to mimic these dark triad traits, and that's probably the best you'll ever do, right? You're probably not going to shift your real personality much. The best you're probably ever going to be able to do is like mimic some things. But, you start to mimic these things, you start to attract women, and you think, what kind of women am I attracting? I see a lot of men that just have repeated experiences with infidelity. All of their relationships are bad. They can't reflect on any of their relationships and be like, yeah, I can look back on my ex positively. That was a good girl. That was a good girl. It's all just like, I've just dated a series of terrible people who treated me terribly and who cheated on me and all of that. And it's like, wow, what's the common denominator there? Obviously, it's you. So yeah, something to think about. Anyway, hope you liked the video. Like, subscribe, hit the bell so you can get notifications. Remember, we have a Patreon, so subscribe, join, support the project. And if you do, there is a Discord where we talk about all of these things. We design surveys and all of that. Anyway, hope you liked the video. I'll make another for you very soon.